There's a number that should make you uncomfortable. 2 million years. That's how long Homo erectus walked this planet. 2 million years of sunrise and sunset, of births and deaths, of footsteps pressed into African soil and Asian mud and European stone. 2 million years of a species that looked almost like us, walked like us, used tools, controlled fire, and spread across half the world. Now here's the number that should really bother you. 300,000 years, maybe less. That's how long we've existed. Homo sapiens. Modern humans. Us. The species currently reading these words, driving cars, launching satellites, and believing we're the pinnacle of human evolution. We've been here for roughly 15% as long as Homo erectus, 1/7 of their timeline. A blink in evolutionary terms. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Your ancestors, the ones who looked basically human from the neck down, who stood upright and walked on 2 legs just like you, who made sophisticated tools and cooked their food over fires they controlled, they lasted 10 times longer than we have. 10 times. They survived ice ages, volcanic winters, climate shifts that would make our current global warming look like a mild temperature fluctuation. They watched continents drift, species rise and fall, entire ecosystems transform and collapse and rebuild. We've been around for maybe 300,000 years. Civilization, the thing we're most proud of, only goes back about 12,000 years. Writing, which lets you read this right now, that's only 5,000 years old. The Industrial Revolution that changed everything about how humans live, that happened 200 years ago. The internet that connects billions of us, that's been widespread for what? 30 years? Homo erectus didn't have any of that. No cities, no agriculture, no written language, no computers, just stone tools that barely changed over hundreds of thousands of years. Simple shelters. Fire. Small groups moving across landscapes, hunting, gathering, surviving. And they did it for 2 million years. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. Because I want you drifting off thinking about deep time, about the vastness of prehistory, about the species that came before us and lasted so much longer than we probably will. Maybe drop a comment telling me where you are right now. Tokyo at midnight? London at dawn? Somewhere in between, we're all here together, descendants of upstarts who've barely started proving we can survive. Here's what nobody tells you about human evolution. We're not the success story. Not yet. We're the new kids, the untested experiment, the species that's been around for the evolutionary equivalent of 15 minutes. Homo erectus. They're the success story. They proved themselves over and over, across nearly 2 million years of Earth's harshest challenges. They earned their place in the fossil record through sheer endurance. And most people have never heard of them. Ask someone on the street about human evolution, and they might mention Neanderthals, maybe Lucy, the famous Australopithecus, if they're really into this stuff. Perhaps Homo habilis. But Homo erectus, the longest-lived human species in history, the one that laid the groundwork for everything we are, they're barely a footnote in popular consciousness. That's a tragedy because their story is our story. Every step you take, every time you stand upright and walk across a room, you're using a body plan that Homo erectus perfected. Every time you cook food over heat, you're using technology they pioneered. Every human population outside of Africa exists because Homo erectus figured out how to leave the continent and survive in radically different environments. We are standing on foundations they built. The oldest confirmed Homo erectus fossils come from East Africa, dated to about 1.9 million years ago. The youngest, found on the Indonesian island of Java, date to between 108,000 and 117,000 years ago. That's 1.8 million years minimum. 1.8 million years of continuous existence as a species. For context, Tyrannosaurus rex, one of the most famous dinosaurs ever, existed for only about 2 million years total. Homo erectus nearly matched the entire lifespan of T-Rex, except dinosaurs had the planet mostly to themselves. Homo erectus had to compete with saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, cave bears, and countless other predators that saw early humans as prey, not apex predators. They didn't have scales or armor. They didn't have claws or fangs. They had stone tools and fire in each other. And somehow, that was enough for almost 2 million years. Compare that to us. Homo sapiens appeared somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, depending on how you define our species. The oldest fossils that look unambiguously like modern humans come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago. Other early fossils from Ethiopia and South Africa cluster around 200,000 to 250,000 years old. So let's be generous and say we've existed for 300,000 years. That's still only 15% of Homo erectus's run. 85% of their timeline stretches beyond our entire existence. They'd already survived 1.5 million years of evolutionary challenges before our species emerged from whatever Homo heidelbergensis populations gave rise to us. And here's the really humbling part. When we first showed up, Homo erectus was still around. For tens of thousands of years, maybe longer, we shared the planet with them. They were in Southeast Asia, holding on in their last refuges in Java, while we were just beginning to spread out of Africa. 2 human species, separated by nearly 2 million years of evolutionary history, briefly coexisting on the same planet. We don't know if we ever met them. The evidence suggests we didn't, that by the time modern humans reached Indonesia, Homo erectus had already gone extinct, probably between 117 and 108,000 years ago. But the timeline is close, uncomfortably close. It's possible that somewhere, at some point, a group of Homo sapiens encountered the last surviving members of humanity's longest-lived species. If that meeting happened, the Homo sapiens would have been looking at their own deep past, at the species that had pioneered nearly everything that made humans human. Upright walking, long-distance traveling, fire control, sophisticated hunting, social cooperation, all of it came from Homo erectus first. And the Homo erectus, if they had enough cognitive capacity to understand what they were seeing, at the species that would spread across every continent, that would develop language and art and technology that would have seemed like magic, at the species that would last, maybe, 1/10 as long as they did before destroying itself or evolving into something else entirely. But would they have recognized us as related? Would we have seemed like kin or like dangerous strangers? Would there have been violence or curiosity or just mutual avoidance? We'll never know. The moment, if it happened at all, left no trace in the archaeological record. What we do know is this: Homo erectus mastered survival in a way we haven't proven we can match. They lived through the Pleistocene, a geological epoch defined by repeated glacial cycles. Ice ages came and went, global temperatures swung wildly, sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet, entire ecosystems migrated, transformed, disappeared. They didn't adapt by evolving rapidly into new forms. That's not what made them successful. They adapted by being flexible within their existing body plan and behavioral repertoire. When forests shrank, they hunted on grasslands. When ice sheets advanced, they moved south or found sheltered valleys. When prey animals migrated, they followed. When one food source disappeared, they exploited another. This is the opposite of what we do. We don't adapt to environments, we reshape environments to suit us. We drain swamps and irrigate deserts and heat buildings, and cool them, and fundamentally transform every landscape we inhabit. It's incredibly effective in the short term. It's let us reach population numbers and technological sophistication that no other species in Earth's history has achieved. But it's only worked for a few thousand years, a geological instant. We have no idea if it's sustainable for even another 1,000 years, let alone 100,000 or 1,000,000. Homo erectus's approach, living within environmental limits and adapting behaviorally rather than transforming everything, that approach worked for nearly 2 million years. Ours has worked for maybe 10,000 years of settled civilization, and already we're seeing stress fractures everywhere. The climate is destabilizing. Ecosystems are collapsing. Resources are running out. We're in a race between technological innovation and environmental catastrophe, and nobody knows which will win. Homo erectus never faced anything like this because they never grew their populations large enough or developed technologies powerful enough to threaten their own environment. They stayed within limits, They didn't have a choice, really, but the result was a species that lasted and lasted and lasted. We're not going to last 2 million years. Let's be honest about that. Either we'll evolve into something else, something so different from current humans that it deserves a new species name, or we'll destroy ourselves, or we'll spread to other planets and diverge into separate populations that become new species. The idea of Homo sapiens in its current form, enduring unchanged for 2 million years, is absurd. But that's exactly what Homo erectus did. Oh, there was some variation. Later populations had slightly larger brains than earlier ones. Regional groups looked somewhat different from each other. But the basic body plan, the fundamental behavioral patterns, the core of what made Homo erectus, stability like that requires something we don't have: patience. A willingness to do what works and keep doing it, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, for longer than our brains can really grasp. We can't do that. We're the innovative species, the creative one, the one that's never satisfied with how things are and always pushing for something new. That drive has taken us to the moon and built the internet and cured diseases and created art that moves the soul. It's also driven us to the brink of climate catastrophe in less than 200 years of industrial activity. Innovation cuts both ways. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to think about this. We're the flashy one, the attention-grabbing one, the species that does amazing things very quickly. But Homo erectus, our ancient predecessors with their patient, conservative, enduring approach to survival, they're the ones who proved that a human species can last. They're the ones who showed it's possible to endure for timescales that dwarf empires and civilizations and everything we think of as permanent. 2 million years. Hold that number in your mind. Feel how vast it is. Count backward from where we are now. 300,000 years takes us to the very beginning of our species. 600,000 years takes us back twice our entire existence. Go back 2 million years and you're looking at a world we can barely imagine. A world without us. Without Neanderthals, without any of the close relatives we think of as human, a world where Homo erectus was just beginning to make their mark. They had no way of knowing how long they'd last, no concept that their species would endure for time spans beyond counting. They just lived, day by day, generation by generation, doing what worked, surviving what came, moving when they had to, staying when they could. And somehow, that simple approach carried them through nearly 2 million years of Earth's history. We've been here for 300,000 years at most, and we already think we own the planet. Maybe we should show a little more humility. Maybe we should look back at Homo erectus and realize that we're still the upstarts, the newcomers, the species that hasn't proven itself over deep time. They earned their place in history through sheer endurance. We're still writing our chapter, and the ending is far from certain. Look down at your legs right now. Notice how long they are relative to your torso. Notice how your knees lock when you stand, how your feet are arched and springy, how your entire skeleton is arranged vertically from your head down through your spine to your pelvis to your feet. This isn't just how you happen to look. This is engineering. Specific, purposeful, evolutionary engineering that took millions of years to perfect. And it was Homo erectus who perfected it first. Before Homo erectus, human ancestors were transitional creatures. Australopithecus like Lucy walked upright, yes, but they were still built for climbing. Their arms were long relative to their legs. Their fingers were curved for grasping branches. Their shoulders and upper bodies retained the powerful musculature of tree-dwelling apes. They could walk, but they were most at home in the trees, or at least never far from them. Homo habilis, the species that came right before Homo erectus, was slightly more committed to ground living but still showed those ape-like proportions. Shorter legs, longer arms, a body that said, "I'm not entirely sure about this whole walking thing yet." Then Homo erectus appeared, and everything changed. For the first time in the human lineage, we have a species that looks recognizably human from the neck down. The proportions are right. The engineering is right. The commitment to a fully terrestrial, fully bipedal lifestyle is absolute and irreversible. We know this because of a skeleton found in Kenya in 1984. The Nariokotome boy, also called Turkana boy, is one of the most complete early human skeletons ever discovered. Dating to about 1.6 million years ago, this adolescent male was somewhere between 8 and 11 years old when he died. His bones were buried quickly in the sediment of an ancient marsh, protected from scavengers and weathering, and they stayed there for over 1.5 million years until paleontologists found them. When they assembled the skeleton, they were looking at something remarkable. This wasn't an ape-like creature experimenting with walking upright. This was an efficient, committed, permanent biped. The Nariokotome boy stood about 5 feet 3 inches tall, but he wasn't fully grown. Estimates suggest he would have reached somewhere between 5 feet 4 inches and 6 feet 1 inch as an adult. That's human height. That's us. His legs were long and slender, built for efficient striding across open ground. His femurs, the thigh bones, angled inward slightly, so his knees were closer together than his hips. The exact configuration modern humans use to walk efficiently without swaying side to side with each step. His pelvis was narrow, designed for walking, not childbirth, which is why Homo erectus females probably had a much harder time giving birth than earlier species with wider pelvises. His feet, we can infer from other Homo erectus fossils and from footprints found in Kenya, were fully modern. With a big toe aligned with the other toes instead of jutting out to the side like a thumb for grasping branches. Feet designed not for climbing but for walking and running, mile after mile, across varied terrain. His arms were proportionally shorter than any previous human ancestor, hanging down to roughly the same relative length as yours. He couldn't brachiate efficiently through trees anymore. He couldn't hang by one arm while reaching for fruit with the other. Those abilities were gone, traded away for a body optimized for something else entirely. Walking. Long distance, efficient, sustainable walking across open landscapes. Even his rib cage was different. Earlier, human ancestors had funnel-shaped rib cages, wide at the top and narrow at the bottom, like apes. This makes sense for creatures who move on all fours or spend time in trees, because it positions the center of mass differently and provides strong attachment points for powerful arms. But the Nariokotome boy had a barrel-shaped rib cage, cylindrical, more like modern humans. This is the rib cage of an obligate biped, a creature that walks upright all the time and needs different internal arrangements to make that work. His spine showed the characteristic curves of a committed walker. That shaped curve you can feel running down your back, that's not just for show. It's a shock absorber, a spring, a carefully evolved adaptation that lets you walk for hours without your brain rattling around in your skull with every footstep. Chimps don't have that. Gorillas don't have that. Earlier human ancestors had only partial versions of it. The Nariokotome boy had the full package. This body plan represents a profound commitment. Once you evolve legs this long and arms this short, once you reshape your pelvis and ribcage and spine for upright walking, there's no going back. You can't return to the trees. You can't knuckle walk like a chimp. You're stuck on the ground, committed to bipedalism, whether you like it or not. That's a dangerous evolutionary bet. Ground-dwelling primates are vulnerable. They can't escape predators by climbing. They can't access food resources in the canopy. They're exposed to weather, to temperature extremes, to every danger that comes with living on the open ground. Earlier, human ancestors hedged their bets, keeping one foot in the trees, so to speak. And it worked. It worked for nearly 2 million years across 3 continents and countless different environments. That body plan, the one they pioneered, became the template for every human species that followed. Neanderthals had it, Denisovans had it, Homo heidelbergensis had it. We have it. Stand up right now and feel how your body is arranged. That's Homo erectus's legacy, in your very bones. But the body plan wasn't just about walking efficiently. It was about walking far, really far. Their body proportions, especially those long legs, suggest they could walk for hours without excessive energy expenditure. They could cover ground at a steady, sustainable pace, moving with their herds, following seasonal resources, exploring new territories. This is what enabled their spread out of Africa. You can't colonize Asia and Europe by walking a few miles a day and then getting tired. You need endurance. You need a body that can keep moving, day after day, across hundreds and eventually thousands of miles. Homo erectus had that body. Their predecessors didn't. Their posture was fully upright, which reduced the amount of body surface area exposed to direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day. When you walk on all fours or in a hunched position, your entire back gets blasted by overhead sun. Everything else is shielded. In the hot, open environments where Homo erectus evolved, this was a significant advantage. But there's more. That upright posture freed their hands completely. Earlier hominins had hands free while walking upright, true, but they still needed them occasionally for balance or for climbing. Homo erectus never needed their hands for locomotion. Not ever. Their hands were free 100% of the time to carry things, manipulate tools, gesture, interact with their environment in ways no previous species could match. This might have been the real revolution. Not just walking upright, which several earlier species did, but walking upright so efficiently and permanently that your hands became purely manipulative organs, completely divorced from locomotion. You could carry food back to camp. You could carry tools to butchery sites. You could carry infants who couldn't cling to body fur that your species was probably beginning to lose. You could carry fire. Their skulls show an interesting mix of primitive and modern features. The brain case was larger than earlier species, ranging from about 600 to over 1,000 cubic centimeters, depending on the individual and the time period. That's still smaller than the modern human average of 1,300 cubic centimeters, but it's substantially larger than Homo habilis and massively larger than Australopithecus. But the skull was also elongated and low, with thick bone and prominent brow ridges jutting out over the eyes. The face was large and projected forward, giving them a profile that would look distinctly non-human if you saw them today. Their jaws were heavy and chinless. Their teeth, while smaller than earlier ancestors, were still large by modern standards. So, from the neck up, Homo erectus looked archaic, primitive, not quite human in the way we think of it. But from the neck down, they were us. They had our body. They moved like we move. They covered ground like we cover ground. The efficiency of their walking gait has been confirmed by fossil trackways found at Illoret in Kenya, dated to about 1.5 million years ago. These footprints show modern human walking patterns. Heel strike, push off from the toes, the whole mechanically efficient process that lets us walk for miles with minimal energy expenditure. And here's what makes this so profound. That body appeared roughly 1.9 million years ago, with early Homo erectus populations in Africa. It persisted, with minor variations, until the last Homo erectus populations went extinct about 110,000 years ago. 1.8 million years without major changes to the basic blueprint. 1.8 million years of the same body plan, working efficiently enough that natural selection never pressured the species to drastically modify it. Think about what changed on Earth during that time. Continental plates drifted. Mountain ranges rose. Ocean levels fluctuated by hundreds of feet. Ice ages came and went, repeatedly, transforming landscapes from tropical to Arctic and back again. Countless species evolved, thrived, and went extinct. The climate lurched between extremes, and through it all, the Homo erectus body plan kept working, kept being efficient enough, adaptable enough, good enough to carry the species through whatever challenges arose. We inherited that body. We changed the skull, made it rounder and higher and thinner boned. We enlarged the brain significantly. We refined the pelvis to accommodate those larger-brained babies. We tweaked 1,000 small details. But the fundamental engineering, the long legs and short arms and upright spine and efficient striding gait, that's all Homo erectus. They figured it out first. They made it work. And every human who's walked since has been using their design. The next time you go for a walk, really pay attention to how your body moves. Feel how your weight transfers from heel to toe with each step. Notice how your arms swing naturally to counterbalance your leg movements. Feel how little effort it takes to maintain a steady walking pace once you find your rhythm. Feel how many miles you could cover, theoretically, if you just kept going. That's Homo erectus. That's their gift to us. The body of a walker, a wanderer, a species built to keep moving across whatever landscape stretches ahead. They proved that this design works. Not over thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands, but over nearly 2 million years of the harshest testing ground imaginable. Earth itself, in all its climatic chaos and ecological complexity. We took their body and added our big brain and our complex culture and our technological innovation. We achieved things they never could have imagined, but we're still walking on the foundation they built, still using the basic engineering they perfected all those millennia ago. And if humanity lasts another million years, another 2 million years, we'll still be walking on legs that Homo erectus designed. And evolution doesn't mess with success. For millions of years, the human story took place entirely in Africa. Australopithecus evolved there. Homo habilis emerged there. Early Homo erectus appeared there. Africa was the cradle, the laboratory, the only place on Earth where anything resembling a human existed. And then, about 1.8 to 2 million years ago, something unprecedented happened. Humans left. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But some populations of Homo erectus began moving north, following the Rift Valley up through East Africa, pushing into regions that no hominin had ever explored. They crossed into the Middle East. They kept going. And within a few 100,000 years, human footprints were scattered across a geographical range that would have seemed impossible for any previous hominin species. This wasn't a migration in the sense we usually think of it. Nobody packed up and decided to move to Asia. There were no leaders saying, "Let's explore new continents." What happened was more gradual, more organic, more inevitable. Populations grew, groups split. Some moved a little farther than their parents had. Over generations, over thousands of years, the expansion was almost imperceptible. But the cumulative effect was staggering. The oldest confirmed Homo erectus fossils outside Africa come from Dmanisi, in the Republic of Georgia, in the Caucasus region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These fossils, discovered starting in the early 1990s, date to about 1.8 million years ago. When paleontologists excavated the site, they found not one or two individuals, but remains from at least 5 different Homo erectus, along with thousands of stone tools and butchered animal bones. The Dmanisi hominins were not physically impressive. They were short, between about 4 feet 10 inches and 5 feet 5 inches tall. Their brains were small, ranging from about 600 to 750 cubic centimeters, only about half the size of a modern human brain. They looked, in many ways, more primitive than the African Homo erectus populations they descended from, and yet, here they were, 1,800 miles from the nearest African Homo erectus sites, living successfully in a completely different environment. This tells us something important. You didn't need to be particularly big or particularly smart to leave Africa. You just needed to be adaptable. The Dmanisi population lived in a region with cold winters, something their African ancestors had never experienced. And they survived. Not just survived, but apparently thrived, based on the number of remains found at the site and the evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years. From Georgia, Homo erectus populations continued spreading. East into Asia, where they would eventually reach China and Indonesia, west into Europe. Though these populations are less well documented and might represent later waves of migration, the speed of this expansion is difficult to determine precisely because the fossil record is so fragmentary. But within a few 100,000 years of leaving Africa, Homo erectus had reached Southeast Asia. Fossils from Java, Indonesia, date to about 1.6 million years ago. That means the journey from East Africa to Indonesia, a distance of roughly 7,000 miles, happened in maybe 200,000 years. Sounds slow. 200,000 years to cover 7,000 miles? But do the math. That's an average expansion rate of about 35 miles per 1,000 years, less than 200 feet per year, one step forward every few days, metaphorically speaking, and you cross an entire continent. Nobody was consciously migrating. Groups were just living their lives, having children, splitting when populations got too large, moving to new territories when resources ran low or conflicts arose. But the cumulative effect, viewed from our perspective millions of years later, looks like an inexorable wave spreading across the old world. From Africa to the Middle East, to the Caucasus, to Central Asia, to East Asia, to Southeast Asia. Thousands of miles, dozens of different environments, countless obstacles overcome. What enabled this expansion? Start with the body. Those long legs we talked about, that efficient walking gait, that's what gave Homo erectus the range to explore. They could walk farther in a day than any previous hominin. They could cover ground without exhausting themselves. A walking range of 10 or 15 miles per day, which is well within Homo erectus capabilities based on their skeletal structure, means new territories could be reached quickly in evolutionary terms. But the body alone wasn't enough. They needed dietary flexibility. Homo erectus was more carnivorous than earlier hominins, based on analysis of their teeth and tools and the animal bones found at their sites. But they weren't obligate carnivores. They could eat plants, tubers, nuts, fruits, whatever was available. This omnivorous flexibility meant they could survive in environments where their preferred food sources weren't available. If large game was scarce, they could fall back on plant foods. If plants were seasonal, they could focus on hunting. This dietary adaptability was crucial because the environments they were moving into were nothing like the African landscapes where they evolved. The open woodlands and savannas of East Africa, with their predictable resources and familiar species, those were gone once Homo erectus crossed out of the continent. In the Middle East, they encountered deserts and arid grasslands. In the Caucasus, seasonal extremes and cold winters. In East Asia, temperate forests and monsoonal climates. In Southeast Asia, tropical rainforests and island environments. Each of these regions required behavioral flexibility. Homo erectus couldn't just do what had always worked. They had to adapt their hunting strategies to local prey, learn which local plants were edible, figure out how to find water in unfamiliar landscapes, deal with predators they'd never encountered before. And they had to do all of this without the benefit of complex language or detailed cultural transmission, at least not the way we practice it. The fossil evidence suggests Homo erectus wasn't just following expanding savannas or grasslands out of Africa. That was the old theory, that they were passive participants in climate-driven habitat expansion. If grasslands spread, but the archaeological evidence doesn't support this simple picture. Homo erectus sites are found in woodlands, grasslands, river valleys, near lakes, in caves, across a stunning diversity of habitats. What this means is that Homo erectus actively chose where to live based on resource availability and other factors. They were generalists, capable of exploiting many different kinds of environments. Specialists are vulnerable when their preferred environment changes. Generalists can roll with the punches. The route they took out of Africa was probably through the Levantine Corridor, the narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Arabian Desert. During periods when the Sahara wasn't as intensely arid as it is today, this corridor would have offered a pathway north with enough water and resources to sustain migrating populations. From there, groups could have moved into the Caucasus region, where the Dmanisi population represents one early successful colony. Other groups might have taken an eastern route, following the coast of the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula into southern Asia. This southern route hypothesis is harder to confirm because many of the archaeological sites from this pathway are now underwater, submerged by rising sea levels over the past million years. But it would explain how Homo erectus reached Southeast Asia so relatively quickly. Once in Asia, the populations began to differentiate. The Asian Homo erectus, sometimes classified as Homo erectus sensu stricto, to distinguish them from African populations, developed some distinct features. They tended to have thicker skull bones, more pronounced brow ridges, and certain dental characteristics that marked them as separate from their African cousins. But they were still recognizably Homo erectus, still part of the same broadly defined species. In Java, Homo erectus found an environment that would sustain them for over 1 million years. The island during the Pleistocene was connected to mainland Asia during periods of low sea level, allowing land animals including humans to colonize it. During high sea level stands, Java became isolated, and the Homo erectus populations there evolved in relative isolation. This led to the latest surviving Homo erectus populations, the ones from Angandong that lasted until around 110,000 years ago. In China, Homo erectus sites like Zhoukudian, near Beijing, show evidence of repeated occupation over hundreds of thousands of years. The famous Peking man fossils from this site, dated to between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, represent middle-period Homo erectus populations that had been in Asia for 1 million years by that point. They were making tools, probably using fire, hunting local deer and other game, and successfully surviving in a temperate climate with cold winters. The European situation is murkier. Some fossils from Spain and Italy that are about 1 million years old might represent Homo erectus populations that moved west from the Middle East. But many researchers think these European specimens are actually an earlier form of Homo heidelbergensis, a descendant species of Homo erectus. The taxonomy gets complicated here, with different experts drawing the species boundaries in different places. What's clear is that humans of some kind were in southern Europe by at least 1 million years ago, and they got there by way of Homo erectus migrations. What's remarkable about this expansion is not just the distance covered, but the permanence of it. These weren't exploratory expeditions that failed and retreated. These were successful colonizations that lasted, in some cases, for over 1 million years. The Asian Homo erectus populations didn't die out after a few generations and get replaced by new waves from Africa. They persisted, adapted, and became distinct regional populations while still remaining part of the broader Homo erectus species. This was the first time in human evolution that our lineage became a multi-continental presence. For millions of years, human ancestors had been African species, confined to a single continent, evolving in a relatively limited range of environments. Homo erectus shattered that limitation. They proved that humans could survive anywhere, not just in the specific African ecosystems where the lineage evolved. Every human migration that followed, every subsequent spread of human species into new territories, was built on the foundation Homo erectus established. When Homo heidelbergensis moved into Europe and Western Asia, they were following routes Homo erectus had already pioneered. When Neanderthals adapted to Ice Age Europe, they were refining survival strategies Homo erectus had first developed. When Homo sapiens spread out of Africa in our Great Migration beginning around 70,000 years ago, we were walking paths that had been walked before. And here's what should give us pause. Homo erectus did all of this with stone tools that barely changed over hundreds of thousands of years, with brains smaller than ours, without complex language as far as we can tell, without writing or maps or any way of recording where they'd been or what they'd learned, except through direct demonstration and observation. They navigated by memory and experience and instinct. They adapted through trial and error and behavioral flexibility, and it worked. For nearly 2 million years, it worked. The Great Escape from Africa wasn't a one-time event. It was a process that continued, waves of expansion and colonization and adaptation that carried humanity out into the world and established us as a genuinely global lineage for the first time in our evolutionary history. We're still living with the consequences of what Homo erectus began. The fact that humans live on every continent, the fact that we're found in every climate zone from Arctic to tropical, the fact that human populations show regional variations in appearance while still being part of the same species, all of that traces back to Homo erectus, leaving Africa and proving that humans could make it anywhere. They opened the door. Every human species after them walked through it, and we're still walking through it today. Imagine you're living 2 million years ago in East Africa. You're Homo erectus, standing upright in the tall grass, scanning the landscape for food and danger. The sun is setting, and you know what comes with darkness. Predators, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, leopards, all of them hunting in the twilight and the dark. Your eyes aren't built for night vision. You can't see them coming until it's too late. You're vulnerable, exposed, just another piece of meat in an ecosystem full of creatures stronger and faster and better armed than you. Then someone in your group does something that will change everything. They pick up a smoldering branch from a lightning-struck tree, something that's been burning naturally, and they bring it back to camp. They feed it. They keep it alive. And suddenly, for the first time in the history of your lineage, you have power over darkness itself. Fire was the first truly transformative technology in human history. Not the first tool, we'll get to stone tools in a moment, but the first technology that fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. With fire, Homo erectus stopped being just another primate trying to survive and became something new, something that could reshape their environment, extend their day into the night, and protect themselves from predators that had terrorized primates for millions of years. The evidence for Homo erectus using fire goes back at least 1 million years, possibly earlier. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, researchers have found burned bones and plant material dating to about 1 million years ago, deep inside the cave where natural wildfires wouldn't have reached. This is strong evidence for controlled fire, for humans deliberately bringing fire into their living spaces and maintaining it. At other sites across Africa and Asia, the evidence accumulates: burned earth, charcoal deposits, bones that have been heated to specific temperatures consistent with cooking rather than wildfire exposure, heat-treated stones that show signs of being deliberately heated to improve their flaking properties for tool making. The pattern is clear. Homo erectus had mastered fire, not everywhere, and not all at once, but progressively, across hundreds of thousands of years. But here's the crucial distinction. Using fire and making fire are two different things. Evidence suggests Homo erectus could use fire for a very long time, maybe 1 million years or more. But they might not have been able to create it on demand until much later, perhaps not until a few 100,000 years ago. Instead, they likely collected fire from natural sources, lightning strikes, and volcanic eruptions and smoldering trees, and then maintained those fires for as long as possible. Think about what this means practically. You can't let the fire go out. Someone has to tend it constantly, feeding it fuel, protecting it from rain, keeping it alive day and night because you don't know when you'll be able to find another natural fire to capture. This requires cooperation, planning, a division of labor. Someone hunts while someone else guards the fire. Someone gathers wood while someone else keeps watch. Fire maintenance became a social activity, a shared responsibility that bound groups together, and the benefits were enormous. Fire provided warmth, allowing Homo erectus to survive in colder climates they couldn't have otherwise inhabited. Remember those populations in the Caucasus, in Georgia, dealing with winters? Fire made that possible. Without it, they would have frozen. Fire provided light, extending the useful day into the evening hours. The tyranny of the sun's schedule was broken. Fire provided protection. Most predators are terrified of fire. A well-maintained fire at the entrance to a cave or around a campsite would keep away the saber-toothed cats and hyenas and other nighttime hunters. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans could sleep on the ground relatively safely. They didn't need to retreat to trees or caves. They had their own portable zone of safety. And fire provided cooking. This might have been the most revolutionary benefit of all. Cooked food is easier to digest than raw food. It's safer, killing parasites and bacteria. It releases more calories from meat and makes tough plant materials edible. Some researchers believe that cooking, enabled by fire, was what allowed the human brain to grow larger over evolutionary time. Big brains are metabolically expensive, requiring lots of energy. Cooked food provides more net energy than raw food, potentially freeing up calories for brain development. Whether or not cooking directly caused brain expansion, it certainly changed the Homo erectus diet and lifestyle. They could exploit food resources their ancestors couldn't. They could survive in places where raw food alone wouldn't provide enough nutrition. Fire, more than any other single technology, expanded the range of environments humans could inhabit. But Homo erectus wasn't just sitting around tending fires, they were also making tools, and the tools they made represent a significant advancement over what came before. Their predecessors, Homo habilis, made simple Oldowan tools, stones with flakes knocked off to create sharp edges, effective for basic tasks but not sophisticated. Homo erectus invented something more complex. The Acheulean hand axe, first appearing in the archaeological record about 1.76 million years ago, shortly after Homo erectus emerged. These weren't just random rocks with sharp edges. These were carefully crafted, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tools that required planning and skill to create. Making an Acheulean hand axe requires you to hold a three-dimensional form in your mind and work the stone systematically to achieve it. You need to understand how stone fractures. You need to control the angle and force of your strikes. You need to work both sides of the stone to create the characteristic bifacial shape. This is not simple knapping. This is engineering. And here's what's remarkable. The basic Acheulean design barely changed for over 1,000,000 years. From 1.76 million years ago until about 300,000 years ago, Homo erectus and their descendants were making essentially the same hand axes. The tools became slightly more refined over time, the craftsmanship improved, but the fundamental design remained stable. To modern humans, this seems strange. We're used to constant innovation, technology that becomes obsolete within years or even months. The idea of using the same tool design for 1,000,000 years is incomprehensible, but to Homo erectus, it made perfect sense. The hand axe worked. It worked for butchering animals, for digging up tubers, for processing wood, for defense if needed, for a dozen different tasks. Why change something that works? This technological conservatism is part of what made Homo erectus so successful. They weren't constantly experimenting with new tools that might fail. They had a proven technology, and they stuck with it. When a young Homo erectus learned to make hand axes from their elders, they were learning techniques that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years and would continue working for hundreds of thousands more. But they did make other tools too. Simple scrapers for processing hides, choppers for breaking bones to access marrow, sharp flakes for cutting meat, stone hammers for various tasks, and probably, though these don't survive in the archaeological record, a wide array of tools made from wood, bone, and other organic materials. Wooden spears for hunting, digging sticks for excavating tubers, containers made from bark or hide for carrying food and water. One of the only wooden implements we have from this period is a 400,000-year-old spear from Schöningen, Germany, made by either late Homo erectus or early Homo heidelbergensis. But this spear is so sophisticated, so well crafted and balanced, that it implies a long tradition of wooden tool-making stretching back hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Homo erectus was probably making wooden tools from very early in their evolutionary history. We just can't prove it because wood doesn't survive for millions of years. The combination of fire and tools gave Homo erectus capabilities that transformed their relationship with the environment. They could hunt more effectively with spears and hand axes. They could process animal carcasses more efficiently. They could cook the meat for maximum nutritional benefit. They could gather plant foods year-round, using fire to make tough tubers edible. They could defend territory and drive off competitors. This technological foundation also enabled cumulative culture. Knowledge could be passed down through generations, not just through genes, but through teaching and learning. A young Homo erectus learned fire maintenance from their parents, learned tool-making from watching and practicing, learned hunting strategies from participating in group hunts. This social transmission of knowledge meant that successful innovations could spread through populations and persist over time. But the pace of innovation was slow, glacially slow by our standards. That million-year stability of the Acheulean hand axe tradition isn't a failure of creativity. It's evidence that Homo erectus had found solutions that worked well enough that there was no strong pressure to change them. In a way, this is the purest form of appropriate technology. Tools that match the needs of the users so well that they remain relevant for geological time periods. Some researchers think Homo erectus might have been cognitively limited compared to later humans, that they couldn't innovate rapidly because they lacked the mental capacity. But this interpretation might be unfair. Rapid innovation isn't always adaptive. In stable environments with proven technologies, conservatism can be more successful than constant experimentation. Homo erectus's slow rate of technological change might reflect not cognitive limitation but adaptive wisdom. After all, they survived nearly 2 million years with these technologies. We've had rapidly changing technology for maybe 10,000 years, and it's already causing planet-wide problems we might not survive. Which approach is actually superior in evolutionary terms? The jury's still out. What we can say definitively is that Homo erectus established the technological foundation that all subsequent human species built upon. Fire maintenance, sophisticated stone tools, wooden implements, these became the baseline. Homo sapiens took them even further, adding complex composite tools and eventually transitioning through countless innovations to the technological civilization we have today. But the foundation, the core technologies that made humans technological creatures in the first place, those came from Homo erectus. They figured out how to control fire, how to make reliable tools, how to use technology to expand their ecological niche. They proved that humans could be not just tool users, which many animals are, but tool makers and tool refiners and tool teachers, passing knowledge across generations in an accumulating tradition. Every time you light a stove or a candle or a campfire, you're using technology that Homo erectus pioneered. Every time you cut something with a knife, you're benefiting from their innovation of crafted stone edges. Every time you cook food, you're following a practice that began over 1 million years ago with small groups of early humans keeping fires alive through African nights. Technology didn't make Homo erectus last 2 million years by itself, but it certainly helped. It gave them flexibility, capability, power over their environment in ways no previous hominin possessed. It let them survive climate changes that would have wiped out less adaptable species. It enabled their spread across continents and their persistence through countless environmental challenges. We are a technological species, arguably the defining technological species in Earth's history. But we're not the first. Homo erectus claimed that title. They showed that humans could be makers and innovators, not just survivors but shapers of their own destiny through the tools they created and the knowledge they passed down. That's a legacy worth remembering. That's a foundation worth honoring. Because everything we've built since, all of our achievements and all of our technology, it all starts with fire in the darkness and stone shaped by skilled hands nearly 2 million years ago. Here's something most people don't understand about the Pleistocene epoch, the time period when Homo erectus lived most of their evolutionary history. It wasn't stable. It wasn't a gentle, predictable environment where species could settle in and get comfortable. The Pleistocene, lasting from about 2.6 million years ago until 11,700 years ago, was characterized by one word: chaos. The climate swung wildly between extremes. Ice ages came and went, not just once but dozens of times. Glacial periods when ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered huge portions of the northern hemisphere, locking up so much water that sea levels dropped by 300 feet or more. Then interglacial periods when the ice retreated and temperatures rose, and coastlines flooded and entire ecosystems shifted hundreds of miles north or south. These weren't slow, gradual changes happening over millions of years. These were rapid transitions, sometimes taking only a few thousand years or even less. The climate could shift from glacial to interglacial conditions within 10,000 years. For a species with generation times of 15 to 20 years, that means major environmental changes could happen within just a few hundred generations, fast enough to be devastating, too slow to adapt through genetic evolution alone. Homo erectus lived through all of it. They experienced at least 20 major glacial-interglacial cycles during their nearly 2 million year existence. 20 times, the climate of Earth fundamentally transformed. 20 times, they had to adapt or die. They adapted. Every single time. During glacial periods, ice sheets advanced south across Europe, Asia, and North America. The tropical and subtropical zones where Homo erectus had evolved and initially thrived shrank toward the equator. Vast areas that had been lush woodland or savanna turned into frozen tundra or dry, cold steppe. Water became locked in ice, making much of the remaining unfrozen landscape arid. Food sources disappeared or migrated to more favorable climates. For a species without fur, without the ability to hibernate, without the option of migrating thousands of miles instantly like birds, this should have been catastrophic. And maybe it was, for some populations. Maybe many Homo erectus groups did go extinct during glacial advances, unable to adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions. But enough survived. Somewhere, that the species persisted. And the populations that survived passed on whatever behavioral or genetic traits had allowed them to endure. How did they do it? Fire, certainly. During glacial periods, the ability to control fire became not just advantageous, but absolutely essential. Without fire, Homo erectus would have frozen in the colder regions. Fire provided the warmth that their hairless or nearly hairless bodies couldn't generate sufficiently on their own. Fire became survival itself during the coldest millennia of the ice ages. But fire alone wasn't enough. They needed shelter. During glacial advances, Homo erectus populations increasingly used caves, not just as occasional refuges, but as home bases. Caves provided natural insulation from extreme cold. Combined with fire, a cave could be kept warm enough for humans to survive even brutal winters. Archaeological sites from glacial periods show evidence of repeated cave occupation, layers of ash, and tools and bones accumulating over thousands of years as generation after generation used the same shelters. They also needed clothing, though proving this archaeologically is nearly impossible since fabric and hide don't preserve for hundreds of thousands of years. But it's hard to imagine Homo erectus surviving glacial Europe or Asia without some form of body covering. They probably used animal skins, scraped clean with stone tools and worn as simple wraps or cloaks. Nothing sophisticated, nothing tailored, but enough to provide an extra layer of insulation against the cold. And they needed social cooperation. A lone Homo erectus wouldn't survive a glacial winter. But a group, working together to maintain fire, sharing warmth, protecting each other from predators and the elements, they had a chance. The Ice Ages probably reinforced social bonds, made cooperation not just beneficial but mandatory. Groups that worked well together survived. During interglacial periods, different challenges arose. As temperatures warmed and ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years flooded. Populations living in low-lying areas had to move inland or perish. The comfortable caves used during glacial periods might become flooded or too warm. Different prey animals returned to regions they'd abandoned during the cold. Plant communities shifted. For a conservative species like Homo erectus, these transitions must have been difficult. They weren't innovators constantly creating new tools and strategies. They relied on proven methods, traditional approaches that had worked for their ancestors. When the environment changed, they had to adapt those traditional methods to new circumstances or develop new approaches, and both options ran counter to their general behavioral conservatism. Yet they succeeded. How? Probably through the same trait that had allowed them to spread across 3 continents in the first place: ecological flexibility. Homo erectus wasn't specialized for any particular environment. They weren't obligate carnivores who would starve if prey disappeared. They weren't specialists who could only survive in specific habitats. They were generalists, able to eat many different foods, live in various environments, adjust their behavior to match circumstances. During cold periods, they probably relied more heavily on hunting because plant foods were scarce. During warm periods, they could exploit a wider variety of plant resources. When large game was unavailable, they could scavenge or hunt smaller animals or focus on gathering. This dietary flexibility meant that even as ecosystems transformed around them, Homo erectus could usually find something to eat. But the climate catastrophes weren't limited to glacial interglacial cycles. The Pleistocene also saw massive volcanic eruptions that affected global climate for years or decades at a time. The Toba supervolcano in Indonesia erupted about 74,000 years ago, long after most Homo erectus populations had gone extinct, but while the last populations in Java were still hanging on. The eruption ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it caused a volcanic winter lasting several years, with global temperatures dropping by several degrees. Earlier eruptions during Homo erectus's long tenure would have had similar effects. Sudden drops in temperature, failed growing seasons, disrupted ecosystems. These events could strike during either glacial or interglacial periods, adding unpredictable catastrophes to the regular climate cycles. And yet Homo erectus populations somewhere always survived. There's also evidence for rapid climate oscillations within longer-term cycles. The climate didn't smoothly transition from glacial to interglacial and back. It stuttered and jumped, sometimes warming rapidly only to crash back into cold conditions within centuries. These abrupt changes, called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, happened repeatedly throughout the Pleistocene. Each one represented a potential extinction crisis for species unable to adapt quickly. Homo erectus somehow rode out dozens of these events over their long history. They probably did so by maintaining flexible behaviors and diverse population structure. Groups in different regions would have faced different immediate challenges. When one region became uninhabitable, populations could contract to more favorable areas. When conditions improved, they could expand again. This constant ebb and flow of population ranges, expanding during good times and contracting during bad, allowed the species as a whole to persist even as individual populations rose and fell. The genetic implications of this survival strategy are interesting. Repeated population bottlenecks, periods when total population numbers crashed, would have reduced genetic diversity each time, but as long as some populations survived somewhere, the species persisted. Modern humans went through a similar bottleneck, possibly associated with the Toba eruption, where global population numbers might have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals. We survived, but we carry the genetic signature of that near extinction in our relatively low genetic diversity compared to other great apes. Homo erectus probably went through multiple such bottlenecks over their nearly 2 million year history. Each ice age advance, each major volcanic event, each rapid climate shift, these were opportunities for the species to go extinct. The fact that they didn't, that they survived every single one of these potential extinction events, speaks to remarkable resilience. Part of that resilience came from their geographic spread. Once Homo erectus had colonized multiple continents, they couldn't all go extinct simultaneously unless something truly planet-wide happened. A climate crisis that devastated African populations might not affect Asian populations as severely. A volcanic winter that made Europe uninhabitable might leave refuges in Southeast Asia. Geographic distribution was insurance against total extinction, but geographic spread alone doesn't explain their survival. Plenty of widely distributed species went extinct during the Pleistocene. Mammoths lived across the northern hemisphere, and they still went extinct. Saber-toothed cats were successful for millions of years, and they disappeared. Something about Homo erectus, some combination of adaptability and cooperation, and behavioral flexibility and sheer persistence, allowed them to outlast competitors and predators and climate catastrophes that destroyed countless other species. Perhaps it was their lack of overspecialization that saved them. Highly specialized species are incredibly successful in their preferred environments, but when those environments change, specialists die. Generalists might not dominate any particular environment, but they can survive in many different ones. Homo erectus was the ultimate generalist. Not the fastest runner, not the strongest fighter, not the biggest brain, not the most sophisticated toolmaker, but good enough at everything to get by in almost any situation. This strategy of being adequate rather than excellent at many things, it's the opposite of how we think about success today. We celebrate specialists, experts, individuals and organizations that excel in narrow domains. But from an evolutionary perspective, that 2 million year run of Homo erectus suggests that being a competent generalist might be more valuable for long-term survival than being an excellent specialist. The climate lessons from Homo erectus are particularly relevant now as we face our own period of rapid climate change. They survived dramatic environmental shifts by being flexible, by maintaining diverse populations, by not being too specialized. We're doing the opposite. We're highly specialized, concentrated in massive cities, dependent on complex supply chains and specific climate conditions. We're betting everything on our technological ability to control or adapt to changing conditions. Maybe it'll work. We have capabilities Homo erectus never dreamed of. We can modify our environment on massive scales. We can predict climate changes before they happen. We can develop new technologies specifically designed to address problems we foresee. But we're also vulnerable in ways Homo erectus never was. Our populations are huge and concentrated. Our food systems are fragile. Our social structures depend on stability and predictability. If the climate shifts as dramatically in the next few centuries as it did repeatedly during the Pleistocene, will we adapt as successfully as Homo erectus did? Will our technology and innovation be enough to compensate for our overspecialization and our massive, vulnerable population structure? These aren't rhetorical questions. Our survival might depend on the answers. Homo erectus proved that humans can survive climate catastrophes. They proved it over and over for nearly 2 million years. They didn't thrive during the worst periods. They just survived, hanging on until conditions improved. But survival was enough. Survival meant they were still here when the ice sheets retreated, when the volcanoes quieted, when the climate stabilized again for a while. We're descendants of survivors, carriers of genes that made it through crises that destroyed most of life on Earth at various points. That's something to remember when the future looks uncertain, when the climate models predict difficult changes ahead, when the challenges seem overwhelming. We come from a lineage that survived the Pleistocene. If Homo erectus could make it through 20 glacial cycles with stone tools and fire, now let's talk about us. Homo sapiens, the wise humans, if our self-given name is to be believed, the species currently dominating every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, the ones who built cities and split atoms and walked on the moon, the evolutionary newcomers who showed up embarrassingly recently and somehow ended up running the planet. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human evolution, the end point, the species that finally got it all right. We have the biggest brains of any human species, averaging 1,300 cubic centimeters compared to Homo erectus's 600 to 1,000. We have complex language that lets us share abstract concepts and plan for distant futures. We have art and music and mathematics and science and all the accumulated knowledge of civilization. Surely we're the success story of human evolution, right? Well, here's a reality check. We've been around for maybe 300,000 years, and that's being generous with the definition of when our species actually emerged. The oldest fossils that look unambiguously like modern Homo sapiens come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago. Other early specimens from Ethiopia and South Africa range from 200,000 to 260,000 years old. But here's the thing. Those early Homo sapiens didn't look exactly like us. They had larger teeth, more robust facial features, some skull characteristics that seem intermediate between earlier human species and modern populations. Some researchers call them archaic Homo sapiens to distinguish them from fully modern humans. The question of when our species actually emerged depends on where you draw the line between archaic and modern, and different experts draw that line in different places. For the sake of argument, let's say Homo sapiens has existed for 300,000 years as a distinct species. That's the most generous estimate. 300,000 years versus Homo erectus's 2 million years. We've been here for 15% of their run. We're the upstart species that's existed for less than a fifth as long as our predecessors. And for most of that 300,000 years, we weren't doing anything particularly impressive. For the first 150,000 years or so, early Homo sapiens in Africa made tools that weren't dramatically different from what other human species were making. They hunted, gathered, lived in small groups, survived. They had larger brains than Homo erectus, sure, but bigger brains didn't immediately translate into revolutionary behavior. The real transformation, the thing that makes us unmistakably modern, rather than just anatomically modern, that came later, much later. Somewhere between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago, depending on the evidence you look at, human behavior underwent what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward. Suddenly, or at least suddenly in archaeological terms, we see an explosion of symbolic behavior. Cave art, personal ornaments, sophisticated tools, long-distance trade, elaborate burial practices. This is when humans started being recognizably us. When we started creating art not for practical purposes but for aesthetic or symbolic reasons. When we started decorating our bodies with jewelry and pigments. When we started thinking and communicating in ways that left clear traces in the archaeological record. After it, we were cultural beings, symbolic thinkers, creatures who could imagine things that don't exist and communicate those imaginations to each other. What caused this transformation? Nobody knows for certain. Maybe it was a genetic change, some mutation that rewired our brains and enabled true symbolic thinking and complex language. Maybe it was cultural, a gradual accumulation of innovations that finally reached critical mass. Maybe it was demographic, populations growing large enough that innovations could spread and be maintained, rather than being lost when small groups went extinct. Whatever the cause, it happened relatively recently. If we're being strict about when humans became behaviorally modern, fully capable of everything we do today, we might only go back 70,000 years or so. That's 3.5% of Homo erectus's timeline. We're not just newcomers, we're the species that showed up 5 minutes ago in evolutionary terms. And yet, in those 300,000 years, and especially in the last 70,000, we've accomplished things that make Homo erectus's achievements look quaint. We spread out of Africa and colonized literally every habitable landmass on Earth. Not just the old world continents that Homo erectus reached, but Australia, which required ocean crossings, the Pacific Islands, which required sophisticated navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean, the Americas, which were empty of humans until we arrived around 15 to 30,000 years ago. We didn't just adapt to existing environments, we transformed them. We developed agriculture about 12,000 years ago, domesticating plants and animals and fundamentally altering landscapes to suit our needs. We built permanent settlements, then villages, then cities housing millions of people. We invented writing, mathematics, science, technology that would seem like magic to our ancestors from even a few thousand years ago. We split the atom. We walked on the moon. We created artificial intelligence. We're on the verge of editing our own genomes, potentially taking control of our evolutionary future. In 300,000 years, and especially in the last 10,000 years of civilization, we've transformed from just another species of smart ape into something unprecedented in Earth's history. So, which species is more successful? The one that lasted nearly 2 million years with slowly changing technology and stable populations living within environmental limits? Or the one that lasted 15% as long but achieved exponentially more in terms of technological sophistication and planetary impact? The answer depends on how you define success. If success means survival over deep time, Homo erectus wins decisively. They proved their species could endure through geological epochs, through climate catastrophes, through countless challenges. They were the tortoise in the evolutionary race, slow but steady, reliable, lasting. If success means innovation and achievement and transforming your environment, we win. We're the hare, fast and flashy, accomplishing in thousands of years what took our predecessors millions. We've achieved things no other species on Earth has even attempted. We've become the dominant planetary force, reshaping ecosystems and climate, and the fundamental composition of the atmosphere. But here's the uncomfortable question. Is our success sustainable? Can we maintain this trajectory for another 200,000 years, let alone 2 million? Or are we burning through resources and destabilizing our environment so rapidly that our success will be self-limiting? Homo erectus never faced this question because they never developed technologies powerful enough to threaten their own survival. They lived within limits, not by choice necessarily, but because they had no choice. Their stone tools and fire gave them advantages, but those advantages never scaled to planetary impact. They couldn't overexploit resources to the point of collapse. They couldn't change the climate. They couldn't drive species extinct through overhunting, at least not to any significant degree. We can do all of those things. We have done all of those things. We've driven countless species extinct. We've changed the composition of the atmosphere. We've depleted fisheries and forests and aquifers. We've created pollution that will persist in the environment for thousands of years. And we've done it all in the last few hundred years, an eye blink in evolutionary terms. This is the paradox of human success. Our intelligence and innovation and technology, the things we're most proud of, might be exactly what makes us vulnerable in the long term. Homo erectus was too simple to destroy themselves. Are we too smart to survive? There's another difference worth noting. Homo erectus was probably a single, relatively stable species throughout most of their history. Regional populations developed some variations, yes, but they remained interfertile, part of the same broad species. They didn't speciate into multiple competing human lineages, at least not for most of their existence. Modern humans, by contrast, shared the planet with multiple other human species for much of our early history. When we emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals were already established in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were in Eastern Asia. Homo erectus was still hanging on in Southeast Asia. Possibly Homo heidelbergensis populations were still around in various regions. Other species like Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis existed in Africa and Indonesia respectively. For tens of thousands of years, possibly over 100,000 years, multiple human species coexisted. By about 40,000 years ago, maybe earlier in some regions, we were alone. Every other human species was gone. Homo sapiens remained. Was this coincidence? Did we outcompete them? Did we interbreed with them until distinct species ceased to exist? Did we directly cause their extinctions through violence or disease? The debate continues, but the correlation is striking. We spread out of Africa, and everywhere we went, other human species disappeared. We know we interbred with some of them. Modern non-African populations carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations carry Denisovan DNA as well, so there was some genetic mixing. But ultimately, the other species still went extinct. We absorbed some of their genes, but we eliminated them as distinct populations. This is another uncomfortable aspect of our success. We might be the human species that succeeded by being the only one left, not necessarily through superior adaptation, but through superior competition or aggression or fertility or disease resistance or pure dumb luck. We survived while everyone else died. Is that really something to be proud of? Homo erectus never eliminated other human species. They coexisted with Homo habilis for hundreds of thousands of years in Africa. They overlapped with various other archaic human forms in different regions. They eventually gave rise to descendant species like Homo heidelbergensis, but they didn't drive their relatives extinct. We did. So here we are, 300,000 years old, give or take, behaviorally modern for maybe 70,000 years, civilized for 12,000 years, industrial for 200 years, and we're already questioning whether we can sustain this trajectory, whether our success is building towards something greater or toward our own extinction. Homo erectus lasted 2 million years by being conservative, by using what worked, by living within limits. We've achieved more in a fraction of that time by being innovative, by constantly pushing boundaries, by refusing to accept limits. Maybe the answer is that we're still writing our chapter. Homo erectus' story is complete. We can look back at their full arc from emergence to extinction and evaluate their success. Our story is still unfolding. We don't know how it ends yet. Maybe we'll last another 2 million years through some combination of technological innovation and adaptation. Maybe we'll evolve into something else, something so different from current humans that it deserves a new species name. Maybe we'll destroy ourselves within the next few centuries. The upstarts don't know their fate yet. We showed up late to the human story, but we arrived with capabilities no previous species possessed. Whether those capabilities lead to long-term survival or rapid self-destruction remains to be seen. We're the experiment still in progress, the species that hasn't proven itself over deep time. And every day we survive, every challenge we overcome, every crisis we navigate, we're adding more data to the question of whether innovation or endurance determines evolutionary success. So, let's get to the heart of the mystery. Nearly 2 million years. How? What specific traits, behaviors, or circumstances allowed Homo erectus to endure for a time span that makes most other species' lifespans look like brief experiments? What was the secret to their extraordinary longevity? The answer isn't simple, and it's not just one thing. It's a combination of factors, some obvious and some subtle, that work together to create a species optimized, not for rapid innovation or dramatic change, but for persistence, for hanging on through whatever came, for being good enough at enough things that extinction could never quite claim them. Start with diet. Homo erectus was omnivorous in the truest sense. They could eat almost anything, meat from hunted or scavenged animals, plant foods including fruits, nuts, seeds, tubers, roots, insects if necessary, shellfish in coastal areas. They weren't picky, and they couldn't afford to be. Specialists who rely on specific food sources go extinct when those sources disappear. Generalists who can shift their diet based on availability survive. Evidence from their teeth and tools shows this flexibility clearly. Their molars were smaller than earlier ancestors, suggesting they were eating more meat and cooked food that didn't require as much grinding. But the molars were still substantial enough to process tough plant materials when needed. Their hand axes and other tools were versatile, useful for butchering animals but also for digging up tubers and processing plant materials. During good times, when prey was abundant and easy to catch, Homo erectus probably ate a lot of meat. Meat is calorie-dense, nutritious, and doesn't require much time to harvest once you've made a kill. During lean times, when prey was scarce or dangerous to hunt, they could fall back on plant foods. This dietary flexibility meant that environmental changes that might starve specialists would only force Homo erectus to adjust their foraging strategies. But dietary flexibility alone isn't enough to explain 2 million years of survival. Plenty of omnivorous species have gone extinct. The next key factor is habitat flexibility. Homo erectus wasn't tied to specific environments. They lived in tropical rainforests, woodlands, savannas, grasslands, river valleys, near lakes and coasts, in caves and rock shelters, even in relatively cold temperate regions. This geographic and ecological range meant that climate changes, which repeatedly transformed landscapes during the Pleistocene, didn't trap Homo erectus in vanishing habitats. When forests shrank, they moved to grasslands. When grasslands became deserts, they relocated to more favorable areas. They didn't need their specific ancestral habitat to survive. They could make do with whatever was available. This adaptability was behavioral, not just physical. Homo erectus didn't evolve different subspecies optimally adapted to each environment. Instead, they modified their behaviors to match circumstances. In colder regions, they used caves more extensively and probably wore animal skins. In warmer areas, they could sleep in the open or build simple shelters. Near water, they exploited aquatic resources. In dry areas, they followed game to water sources. Then there's social structure. While we can't observe Homo erectus behavior directly, we can infer from their sites and from comparison with other social primates that they lived in groups. Probably small bands of 15 to 50 individuals, though numbers would have varied based on resource availability and other factors. These groups provided crucial advantages. Social living meant division of labor. Some individuals could hunt, while others gathered plant foods. Some could maintain fire, while others made tools. Some could watch for predators, while others cared for infants. This specialization within groups made survival more efficient without requiring specialization at the species level that would reduce flexibility. Social groups also provided protection. Alone, Homo erectus was vulnerable to predators, especially at night. But a group with fire and weapons and multiple adults watching for danger could defend themselves. The fossil record shows that Homo erectus did sometimes fall prey to large carnivores, but they clearly survived predation pressure well enough to persist for nearly 2 million years. Groups facilitated knowledge transmission. Young Homo erectus learned tool-making from watching adults, learned fire maintenance through observation and participation, learned which plants were edible and which animals could be safely hunted through social teaching. This cultural transmission meant that beneficial innovations could spread through populations and persist across generations without requiring genetic changes. But perhaps most importantly, social groups provided care for the vulnerable. We have fossil evidence that some Homo erectus individuals survived serious injuries and disabilities that would have been fatal for a solitary animal. A skull from Dmanisi shows an elderly individual who had lost most of their teeth long before death. Without teeth, they couldn't process raw food effectively. They must have been fed by other group members who shared soft or processed food with them. This is evidence of compassion, of social bonds strong enough that the group sustained members who couldn't fully contribute. Another crucial factor, technological conservatism. This sounds counterintuitive. Wouldn't a species that innovates rapidly be more successful? Not necessarily. Rapid innovation means constant experimentation, and experiments often fail. A species that constantly changes its core technologies and strategies is a species that might innovate itself into an evolutionary dead end. Homo erectus kept using what worked. Their Acheulean hand axe technology persisted for over 1 million years with only minor modifications. Why? Because it worked well enough. The hand axes performed all the necessary tasks. Young individuals could learn to make them by watching elders. The tools were reliable and versatile. There was no pressure to innovate because the existing technology was adequate. This conservatism extended to behavior as well. Homo erectus didn't revolutionize their lifestyle every few thousand years. They found strategies that worked: hunting and gathering patterns, seasonal movements, social structures, and they stuck with them across vast time periods. This created stability, predictability, a pattern of life that could be maintained indefinitely as long as the environment remained roughly stable. And when the environment did change dramatically during glacial cycles and other climate shifts, Homo erectus adapted behaviorally, rather than needing to evolve new physical traits or develop revolutionary new technologies. They moved to better areas, they adjusted their hunting patterns, they used caves more or less frequently based on need, they modified existing strategies rather than creating entirely new ones. Population structure also matters. Homo erectus existed as multiple regional populations spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia. These populations were probably somewhat isolated from each other for long periods, developing local adaptations and variations, but they weren't so isolated that they became separate species. Gene flow probably continued sporadically between regions, maintaining Homo erectus as a single species. This metapopulation structure is incredibly resilient. If one regional population goes extinct due to local catastrophe, others survive elsewhere. If a disease devastates African populations, Asian populations carry on. If climate change makes Europe uninhabitable, populations persist in Africa. Total extinction requires simultaneous collapse of all populations everywhere, which is extremely unlikely. Compare this to species that exist as single populations or in very limited geographic ranges. One catastrophe, one disease outbreak, one climate shift, and they're gone. Homo erectus's wide distribution was insurance against extinction. They couldn't all die at once unless something truly planetary happened. Their relatively simple needs also contributed to longevity. They needed fire, which they could obtain from natural sources or eventually create themselves. They needed simple stone tools, which could be made anywhere suitable stone was available. They needed shelter, which could be caves or simple constructed structures. They needed water and food, which they could find in most environments. These basic requirements could be met almost anywhere, making them less vulnerable to resource shortages than species with more specialized needs. Their reproduction strategy fit their lifestyle. Homo erectus, like other humans, had long childhoods relative to body size. This allowed time for learning complex skills and social behaviors. But they probably reached reproductive maturity earlier than modern humans, perhaps by age 13 or 14 instead of our 16 to 18 years. This meant more potential generations over the same time period, allowing faster population recovery after crashes. They also probably had relatively high fertility compared to modern humans. Without modern medicine or safety measures, infant and child mortality would have been high. But women could potentially have many pregnancies over their reproductive years, enough to maintain population numbers even with high mortality rates. This reproductive potential meant populations could bounce back from crashes caused by climate events or disease. Brain size also played a role, though maybe not the way you'd expect. Homo erectus brains, ranging from 600 to over 1,000 cubic centimeters, were larger than earlier hominins but smaller than later humans. This represents a sweet spot, big enough for significant cognitive capabilities including tool-making, fire control, and social cooperation, but not so large as to create problems. Bigger brains are metabolically expensive. They require lots of energy to grow and maintain. They require longer childhoods for development, which means longer periods of dependency and vulnerability. They create childbirth complications because large-brained babies have large heads that are difficult to birth through a bipedal pelvis. Modern humans pay all these costs for our massive brains. Homo erectus got significant cognitive advantages without paying the full metabolic and developmental costs. Their moderate brain size was apparently sufficient for their lifestyle. They could make tools, use fire, cooperate in groups, communicate effectively enough to coordinate activities. They didn't need the additional cognitive capacity that came with larger brains because their survival strategies didn't require it. More brain wouldn't have made them significantly better at what they did. So they maintained a stable brain size for most of their evolutionary history, avoiding the costs that come with further enlargement. Finally, there's an element of pure luck. Evolutionary success always involves chance, the right mutation appearing at the right time, a population happening to be in a refuge area during a climate catastrophe. Homo erectus almost certainly benefited from lucky breaks over their long history, moments when things could have gone wrong but didn't. But luck alone can't explain 2 million years. That's too long for pure chance. What Homo erectus had was a suite of traits and behaviors that made them consistently lucky. They were in the right place often enough because they lived in many places. They had the right adaptations often enough because they were adaptable generalists. They survived crises often enough because they had flexible strategies and wide distributions. Put it all together: dietary flexibility, habitat flexibility, social cooperation, technological conservatism, metapopulation structure, simple requirements, appropriate reproduction, moderate brain size, and yes, some luck. Each factor alone isn't extraordinary. Many species have some of these traits, but the combination, the particular mix of characteristics that Homo erectus possessed, proved extraordinarily effective at promoting long-term survival. They were the Goldilocks species. Not too specialized, not too generalized, not too innovative, not too conservative, not too smart, not too dumb, not too widespread, not too concentrated. Everything about them was just right for persistence, for hanging on, for surviving whatever came. And what came over nearly 2 million years was everything Earth could throw at a species. Ice ages, volcanic winters, environmental catastrophes of every kind. Homo erectus weathered it all. Not because they were perfect, but because they were adequately adapted to nearly everything and over-adapted to nothing. They proved that in evolution, being good enough at many things beats being excellent at one thing. They demonstrated that persistence is its own form of excellence, and they left a legacy that every subsequent human species, including us, has built upon. We may be smarter and more innovative and more technologically advanced, but we're still trying to match their fundamental achievement: survival over deep time. Here's the paradox that should keep evolutionary biologists awake at night. Homo erectus existed for nearly 2 million years and achieved a certain level of cultural and technological sophistication that remained relatively stable throughout their history. We've existed for maybe 300,000 years, a fraction of their timeline, and we've achieved exponentially more. Cities, agriculture, writing, mathematics, space exploration, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence. How did we accomplish so much in so little time? The obvious answer is that we're smarter. We have bigger brains, averaging 1,300 cubic centimeters compared to Homo erectus's 600 to 1,000. More brain tissue should mean more cognitive capacity, right? More processing power for solving problems, remembering information, planning for the future, understanding abstract concepts. And that's true to some extent. Brain size does correlate with cognitive abilities across species, though the relationship isn't perfectly linear. But brain size alone can't explain the magnitude of difference between what Homo erectus achieved and what we've achieved. The latest Homo erectus populations, the ones living in Java 100,000 years ago, had brain sizes approaching 1,000 cubic centimeters. That's 75% of our brain volume. Were they 75% as smart as us? That seems generous, based on their archaeological record. They were still making essentially the same tools their ancestors had made 1 million years earlier. Still living in small groups, still hunting and gathering, still lacking any evidence of symbolic thought or complex culture. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens with our 1,300 cubic centimeter brains were creating cave art, making complex composite tools, developing long-distance trade networks, and laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. The difference in outcomes vastly exceeds the difference in brain size. Something else had to be going on. Language is the most likely candidate. Not just communication, which all social animals have to some degree, but true syntactic language capable of expressing abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, stories about the past, and plans for the future. Language that can transmit complex information efficiently across generations. Language that allows collaborative problem-solving by letting multiple individuals share knowledge and perspectives. We don't know when fully modern language evolved. Speech doesn't fossilize, but we can make inferences based on anatomy and behavior. The shape of the vocal tract, the position of the hyoid bone in the throat, the structure of the brain regions associated with language, these provide clues. Most researchers think Homo sapiens developed modern language capacity somewhere between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago. Neanderthals probably had sophisticated language too, based on their anatomy and cultural achievements. Homo erectus might have had some form of communication beyond simple calls and gestures. Their social cooperation and geographic spread suggest they could share information effectively. But they probably didn't have language as we know it. The complexity of information you can transmit without syntactic language is limited. You can point at things. You can demonstrate techniques. You can use simple sounds to coordinate group activities. But you can't explain abstract concepts. You can't tell stories about events that happened years ago to people who weren't there. You can't plan collaboratively for contingencies that haven't happened yet. Language transforms teaching and learning. Without language, a young Homo erectus learned toolmaking by watching an adult nap stone for hours, trying to copy the movements, gradually figuring out through trial and error what worked. This process took time and resulted in a lot of failed attempts. With language, a young Homo sapiens could receive verbal instruction. Strike the stone at this angle. Look for the grain in the rock. These nodules work better than those. Verbal teaching accelerated skill acquisition dramatically. Language also enabled cumulative culture. Without language, each generation has to rediscover most techniques from observation and experimentation. Small innovations might spread within a group, but complex multi-step processes that take time to learn are difficult to transmit faithfully. With language, you can explain not just what to do, but why. You can share the reasoning behind techniques. You can describe failed attempts so others don't repeat the same mistakes. Knowledge accumulates across generations instead of being constantly lost and rediscovered. This is why human culture changes so much faster than our genetics. Genetic evolution takes thousands of generations to produce significant changes. Cultural evolution can happen within a single generation. A clever innovation, transmitted through language and teaching, can spread through an entire population in decades or less. Homo erectus probably had some capacity for cultural transmission, but without complex language, their culture changed at a much slower pace. Another key difference is symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing, to create and understand symbols that stand for concepts, objects, or ideas. This capacity seems to be uniquely developed in Homo sapiens, or at least we express it far more than any other species. The earliest clear evidence of symbolic thinking comes from Africa between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Ochre pigments used for body decoration, shell beads worn as jewelry, engraved patterns on ochre and bone that seem decorative rather than functional. By 40,000 years ago, we have spectacular cave art in Europe and Indonesia, showing not just images but complex scenes with narrative elements. Homo erectus left no evidence of symbolic thinking, no art, no personal ornaments, no engravings or decorations beyond what was functionally necessary for tools. Their world was apparently concrete and immediate. Ours is filled with abstractions and symbols. We use symbols to represent everything from numbers to emotions to complex philosophical concepts. This symbolic capacity enables mathematics, writing, music notation, computer programming, all the abstract systems that underpin modern civilization. Social complexity is another factor. Homo erectus lived in groups, certainly, but probably relatively small ones. Modern hunter-gatherer groups typically number 20 to 50 individuals, and Homo erectus groups were probably similar. These groups might have interacted occasionally with neighboring groups for mating or trade, but the total number of individuals any one Homo erectus regularly interacted with was probably under 100. Homo sapiens developed larger and more complex social networks. We can maintain meaningful relationships with around 150 people, sometimes called Dunbar's number, and we can recognize and track information about many more. This expanded social capacity allowed larger groups, more complex social hierarchies, more elaborate cooperation. Villages of hundreds or thousands of people became possible. Cities of millions followed. The social complexity we're capable of vastly exceeds what Homo erectus achieved. This social capacity enabled specialization on a scale Homo erectus never approached. In a group of 30 Homo erectus, everyone had to be a generalist. Everyone needed basic hunting skills, basic gathering knowledge, basic tool-making ability. But in a village of 300 Homo sapiens, you could have specialists, expert toolmakers, exceptional hunters, skilled healers, talented artists. Each person could focus on what they did best and trade their products or services with others. Specialization drives innovation. When you spend thousands of hours practicing one skill instead of dividing your time among many skills, you get better at it. You push the boundaries of what's possible. This is how technologies advance. Homo erectus generalists maintained functional technologies. Homo sapiens specialists perfected and revolutionized them. Population size matters too. Larger populations mean more potential innovators, more minds working on problems, more chances for beneficial mutations or ideas to appear. Homo erectus probably never had huge populations. Their total numbers might have been tens of thousands or low, hundreds of thousands at most, spread across 3 continents. During population bottlenecks, which happened repeatedly during the Pleistocene, their numbers might have dropped to just thousands. Homo sapiens reached much larger populations, even before agriculture. By the end of the Pleistocene, around 12,000 years ago, human populations might have reached a few million globally. More people means more innovation, more cultural exchange, more pressure to develop better technologies to support larger populations. Population growth and innovation reinforced each other in a feedback loop that Homo erectus never experienced. Then there's neoteny, the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. Homo sapiens is more neotenous than earlier humans. Our skulls remain rounded and smooth like juvenile apes, rather than developing the heavy brow ridges and pronounced facial features of adults of other species. Our brains remain plastic and capable of learning throughout life rather than becoming fixed in childhood patterns. This extended developmental plasticity might contribute to our innovative capacity. We stay curious, playful, willing to experiment. We don't settle into rigid behavioral patterns as quickly as other species. This flexibility of thought and behavior enables the rapid cultural changes that characterize human history. Cooperation also distinguishes us. While Homo erectus certainly cooperated within their groups, Homo sapiens cooperates on larger scales and in more complex ways. We can coordinate activities among thousands of individuals we don't personally know. We can establish norms and rules that govern behavior across entire societies. We can work toward abstract collective goals that won't be achieved in our lifetimes. This capacity for large-scale cooperation enabled everything from building pyramids to mounting moon missions. And there's something else, something harder to quantify but potentially crucial: curiosity and drive. Homo sapiens seems unusually motivated to explore, experiment, and innovate. We're not content with good enough. We want better. We're not satisfied with tradition. We seek novelty. This psychological drive toward innovation might be as important as our cognitive capabilities in explaining our rapid cultural evolution. Homo erectus was conservative. They found strategies that worked and stuck with them. This conservatism served them well, enabling their long-term survival. But it also meant they never pushed beyond certain limits. They never asked, "What if we tried this differently?" often enough to revolutionize their way of life. We ask that question constantly, sometimes to our detriment, as we innovate ourselves into problems our ancestors never faced. But that drive to experiment, to try new things, to refuse to accept that current methods are optimal, that's what transformed us from just another species of smart ape into the civilization-building, planet-altering force we are today. The combination of all these factors, language, symbolic thinking, social complexity, specialization, population size, neoteny, cooperation, and psychological drive, created a feedback loop. Language enabled better teaching, which spread innovations faster, which increased cultural complexity, which required more sophisticated language, which enabled even better teaching, and so on. Each element reinforced the others. This feedback loop accelerated over time. The more culture we accumulated, the faster we could accumulate more. We reached a tipping point somewhere between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago, where human culture began changing not just faster than genetic evolution, but faster than any previous species' culture had ever changed. Homo erectus changed slowly. Their stone tools show this clearly. The Acheulean hand-axe tradition persisted for over 1 million years with minimal modification. To modern humans, This seems impossibly conservative. But to Homo erectus, it was rational. They had tools that worked, teaching methods that transmitted skills adequately across generations, survival strategies that had proven successful over hundreds of thousands of years. We couldn't maintain that kind of stability if we tried. Our cultures are inherently unstable, constantly shifting and evolving. Technologies that seem cutting-edge become obsolete within decades. Social norms that were universal become controversial within generations. The world our great-grandparents lived in is almost unrecognizable compared to ours, and the world our great-grandchildren inherit will be almost unrecognizable compared to ours. This is the trade-off. Homo erectus bought stability at the cost of stagnation. They endured for nearly 2 million years doing essentially the same things in essentially the same ways. We bought innovation at the cost of stability. We've achieved more in 300,000 years than they did in 2 million, but we have no idea if our approach is sustainable over the deep timescales they proved theirs was. Maybe there's wisdom in their conservatism. Maybe the pace of change we've embraced will ultimately prove maladaptive, driving us to extinction far sooner than the slow, steady Homo erectus approach would have. Or maybe our innovations will carry us through challenges they could never have survived, enabling us to persist not just for millions of years but for tens of millions, spreading across solar systems and galaxies. We're different from them, despite being so new, because we evolved different cognitive and cultural capabilities that enabled exponentially faster change. Whether those capabilities make us more or less likely to survive over the long term, that's still an open question. We've only been testing them for a few 100,000 years. Homo erectus tested their approach for nearly 2 million. The experiment isn't over yet. Every story has an ending. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus had avoided theirs. They'd survived ice ages, volcanic winters, climate catastrophes, and countless challenges that destroyed other species. They'd spread across 3 continents. They'd proven that their conservative, persistent approach to survival could outlast almost anything. But eventually, inevitably, their story ended too. The last known Homo erectus lived on the Indonesian island of Java, in a region called Ngandong along the Solo River. When Dutch archaeologists excavated the site in the 1930s, they found something extraordinary: 12 skulls and 2 leg bones, representing what appeared to be a group of Homo erectus individuals who had died together, possibly in a flood that washed their remains downstream and deposited them in sediments where they would lie undiscovered for over 100,000 years. For decades, scientists argued about how old these fossils were. Initial estimates ranged wildly, from 500,000 years ago to as recent as 27,000 years ago. If the youngest dates were correct, it would mean Homo erectus survived long enough to potentially overlap with modern humans in Southeast Asia, raising fascinating questions about whether our species ever met. But improved dating techniques eventually provided clearer answers. In 2019, a comprehensive study using multiple dating methods concluded that the Ngandong fossils are between 108,000 and 117,000 years old. This makes them the youngest confirmed Homo erectus remains ever found, the last of their kind, the final survivors of a species that had dominated much of the Old World for nearly 2 million years. 110,000 years ago, give or take. That's when the last Homo erectus probably died. Think about what Earth was like at that moment. Neanderthals were thriving across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were established in Eastern and Central Asia. Homo sapiens had been around in Africa for at least 100,000 years, maybe 200,000, and were beginning to expand beyond the continent. Multiple human species coexisted across the Old World, each adapted to different regions and environments. And in Java, isolated on an island that had become cut off from mainland Asia as sea levels rose, the last populations of humanity's longest-lived species were making their final stand. They weren't dramatically different from their ancestors who had lived 1 million years earlier. They still made similar tools, still hunted the local deer and wild cattle, still lived in small groups, moving across familiar landscapes, using strategies that had worked for their lineage since before modern humans existed. What killed them? Why did a species that had survived nearly 2 million years finally go extinct? The researchers who dated the Ngandong fossils have a theory. climate change. Not the gradual kind, but rapid, dramatic environmental transformation that made Java uninhabitable for Homo erectus. The fossil evidence from Ngandong shows that Homo erectus there lived in open woodland environments, ecosystems similar to African savannas, with scattered trees, grasslands, and large herbivores. These were the environments their ancestors had evolved in, the landscapes they were adapted for. But around 120,000 years ago, Java's climate shifted. The region became wetter, more humid. The open woodlands transformed into dense tropical rainforest. Rainforests are difficult environments for humans without sophisticated technology. The floor of a mature rainforest is relatively poor in food resources because most of the productivity is in the canopy, dozens of feet above ground. Large game animals that thrive in open woodland become scarce or shift their behavior. The hunting strategies that worked in open environments stop being effective in dense jungle. Even finding your way through the tangle of vegetation becomes challenging. Homo erectus had survived climate changes before, many times. But Java was an island. When the sea level was low during glacial periods, Java connected to mainland Southeast Asia, allowing animals, including humans, to colonize it. When sea level rose during interglacials, Java became isolated. The Homo erectus populations there were trapped, so when the climate shifted and rainforest replaced their preferred open woodland, they couldn't migrate to better environments. They were stuck, forced to adapt to conditions their species had never successfully dealt with before. And apparently, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Within maybe 10 or 20,000 years of the climate shift, the last Homo erectus were gone. This is speculation, of course. We don't have a complete record of their extinction. We have fossils from around 110,000 years ago, and then nothing. They disappear from the archaeological record. Did every single individual die during one catastrophic event? Probably not. More likely, their populations declined over generations as the changing environment made survival increasingly difficult. Birth rates might have dropped. Infant mortality increased. Groups might have fragmented as resources became scarcer. Eventually, the population fell below sustainable levels, and the last individuals died without leaving viable offspring. It's a quiet ending for a species that had been so successful for so long. No dramatic extinction event, no asteroid impact or volcanic eruption or ice age. Just a changing climate on a single isolated island, transforming an environment until the species adapted to it couldn't survive there anymore. But there's another factor that might have played a role: competition. By 110,000 years ago, other human species were expanding across Southeast Asia. Homo sapiens was beginning to spread beyond Africa. Denisovans were already established in the region. Even if these other species never directly encountered the last Homo erectus on Java, they might have indirectly contributed to their extinction by occupying territories that could have served as refuges or sources of new populations. In the past, when local Homo erectus populations went extinct, they could be replaced by populations migrating from other regions. If Java became temporarily uninhabitable, populations could return later when conditions improved. But if all the nearby source populations were gone, replaced by other human species, then extinction on Java meant total extinction for the species. There was nowhere for replacement populations to come from. This is particularly poignant because Homo erectus had pioneered the very migration routes that later human species used. They'd been the first to spread across Asia. They'd established populations from the Middle East to Indonesia. And then, gradually, their populations were replaced. Not necessarily through violent conflict, though that might have occurred. Mostly through slower processes, competition for resources, lower reproductive rates compared to other species, inability to adapt as quickly to changing conditions. By 150,000 years ago, Homo erectus had probably disappeared from Africa and Europe, replaced by Homo heidelbergensis and its descendants including Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. By 130,000 years ago, they were probably gone from mainland Asia too, replaced by Denisovans and early migrations of Homo sapiens. Java was their last refuge, the final place where the original human colonizers still held on. And then they were gone. The species that had opened up the world for humanity, that had proven humans could live anywhere, that had survived longer than any human species before or since, they went extinct. The longest chapter in human evolutionary history closed with a whimper, not a bang, a population stranded on an island, unable to adapt to environmental changes, slowly dwindling until the last individual died and no one replaced them. We don't know what those last Homo erectus thought or felt, if they were even capable of understanding that they were the final members of their species. They probably lived their lives much like their ancestors had, hunting and gathering, maintaining their traditions, teaching their children what they knew. They didn't know they were living through an ending. They were just trying to survive, same as their lineage had been doing for nearly 2 million years. But survive they could not. The combination of environmental change, geographic isolation, and replacement by other human species proved too much even for a species as persistent as Homo erectus. After 1.9 million years of continuous existence, longer than almost any large mammal species in history, they finally went extinct. Their extinction raises uncomfortable questions for us. If Homo erectus, with nearly 2 million years of proven survival success, could go extinct when conditions turned against them, what does that say about our chances? We've been around for maybe 300,000 years. We're unproven over deep time. We're currently transforming our environment more rapidly than any climate change Homo erectus experienced. We're concentrating ourselves in vulnerable megacities. We're dependent on complex, fragile systems for food, water, and energy. If climate change or some other catastrophe turns conditions against us, will we adapt successfully? Or will we, like Homo erectus on Java, find ourselves trapped in an environment we can no longer survive in, unable to find refuge, slowly declining toward extinction? We have advantages they lacked. We have sophisticated technology. We have global communication. We understand what's happening and can potentially develop solutions. But we also have vulnerabilities they never faced. Our huge populations need enormous resources. Our specialized societies can collapse if key systems fail. Our accumulated knowledge could be lost if civilization breaks down. The story of Homo erectus's extinction is a reminder that no species is guaranteed survival, no matter how successful they've been in the past. Adaptability doesn't mean invincibility. Even species that seem destined to last forever can find themselves in circumstances where all their previous successes mean nothing. But there's another way to think about Homo erectus's end. Yes, they went extinct as a distinct species, but they also evolved into something else. Homo heidelbergensis, the species that emerged from African Homo erectus populations around 600,000 years ago, was their descendant, and Homo heidelbergensis gave rise to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The Asian populations that died out in Java, those were an evolutionary dead end, but the African populations that evolved into later species, those carried the Homo erectus legacy forward. Their genes, their body plan, their fundamental adaptations, all of those persist in us. We're not separate from them. We're their continuation, their evolutionary descendants, carriers of whatever made them successful for so long. This is the paradox of extinction in an evolving lineage. A species can go extinct while simultaneously giving rise to descendant species that carry on its legacy. Homo erectus as a distinct form is gone, but Homo erectus as a stage in human evolution, as the foundation that made all subsequent human species possible, that persists in every human alive today. Still, for the last populations in Java, the ones with no descendants, no evolutionary future, extinction was final. They were the end of a line that had stretched back nearly 2 million years. When the last of them died, something irreplaceable was lost. A species that had proven itself over deep time, that had survived challenges we can barely imagine, that had opened up the world for all human species that followed, gone forever. Maybe there's a lesson in humility here. Homo erectus did everything right by the standards of evolutionary success. They lasted longer than we've even existed. They spread farther than most species ever do. They adapted to more environments than almost any mammal. And still, eventually, they went extinct. If they couldn't survive forever, neither will we. The question is whether we can last even a fraction as long as they did before our own story ends. So here we are, at the end of this journey, through deep time. standing at the present moment, looking backward across nearly 2 million years of Homo erectus history and forward into our own uncertain future. What have we learned? What does it mean that one human species lasted 10 times longer than we've existed? What lessons does their story hold for us? Start with the most obvious one. Survival is not about being the best. That distinction probably belongs to us, or possibly to Neanderthals who had brains as large or larger than ours. Again, that's us, with our constantly evolving tools and techniques. They weren't the fastest, strongest, or most specialized. They were, in almost every measurable way, adequate rather than exceptional, and yet they lasted nearly 2 million years. They outlived dozens of other hominin species that emerged and disappeared during their tenure. They survived climate changes that would have devastated specialists. They proved that in the long game of evolution, adequate and adaptable beats exceptional and specialized almost every time. This contradicts how we usually think about success. We celebrate excellence. We reward innovation. We admire specialists who push boundaries and achieve things nobody else can. And in the short term, that approach works wonderfully. Specialization creates efficiency. Innovation drives progress. Excellence achieves remarkable things. But over deep time, over millions of years, these strategies can become liabilities. The environment changes. The specialized niche disappears. The innovative society outgrows its resource base. The excellent adaptation becomes maladapted. Homo erectus' strategy was different. They were the generalists, the steady ones, the species that did many things adequately rather than one thing exceptionally. They weren't trying to be the best. They were trying to survive. And for nearly 2 million years, they succeeded at that goal better than any human species before or since. But here's the second lesson, and it's more troubling. Even perfect adaptation to survival doesn't guarantee immortality. Homo erectus did everything right. They spread geographically to ensure against local extinctions. They maintained flexible diets and behaviors. They lived within environmental limits. They passed on successful strategies across hundreds of thousands of generations. And still, eventually, they went extinct. This should terrify us. Because if they couldn't last forever, why should we think we can? We're more vulnerable than they were in almost every way. We're concentrated in massive cities rather than distributed in small groups. We're dependent on complex systems rather than possessing individual survival skills. We're transforming our environment rapidly rather than adapting to it. We've been around for 15% as long as they lasted. What makes us think we're destined for permanence when they weren't? The answer, probably, is that we shouldn't think that. No species lasts forever. The average lifespan for a mammal species is about 1 to 2 million years. Homo erectus matched or exceeded that average, making them unusually successful by evolutionary standards. We'll face the same fate eventually. The only question is whether we hasten it through our own actions, or whether we buy ourselves as much time as possible by learning from their example. And that's the third lesson. Slow and steady might be wiser than fast and innovative. This is heretical in modern society. We worship disruption, celebrate rapid change, prize innovation above stability. The pace of technological and social change has accelerated throughout human history, and we generally see that acceleration as progress. Faster is better. Newer is superior. Change is improvement. Homo erectus would have disagreed if they could have understood the concept. Their Acheulean hand axes persisted for over 1 million years. Their social structures probably remained stable for hundreds of thousands of years. Their way of life barely changed over time, spans that encompass the entire history of human civilization many times over. By our standards, this is stagnation. By evolutionary standards, it's stability. And stability kept them alive far longer than innovation has kept us alive. Maybe there's wisdom in conservatism. Maybe the old ways persist because they work, and constant innovation is actually destabilizing rather than improving. Maybe the societies that survive longest will be the ones that change slowly, carefully, maintaining what works while only adopting innovations that have proven themselves over generations. This is the opposite of how we operate, and it's impossible to know whether our approach or theirs is ultimately more successful until we see how our story ends. The fourth lesson is about humility. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the species that finally got everything right. We have the biggest brains, the most sophisticated culture, the most powerful technology. We've achieved things that would seem like magic to any previous human species. We've split atoms, sequenced genomes, walked on other worlds. Surely we're the success story of human evolution. But Homo erectus would challenge that definition of success. They would point to their nearly 2 million year tenure on Earth and ask, "How long have you been here? 300,000 years? That's nice. Come back when you've lasted 2 million, and we'll talk about success. You've built impressive things, sure, but can those things sustain your species over deep time? You've changed the world, absolutely, but have you changed it in ways that will let you survive, or in ways that will destroy you? We don't know yet. We're writing our chapter of the human story in real time, and we don't know how it ends. Homo erectus's chapter is complete. 2 million years, spread across 3 continents, surviving every challenge the Pleistocene could throw at them until conditions finally shifted beyond their adaptive capacity. That's a successful species by any measure. We're unproven. We're the experiment still running. We might achieve things that make Homo erectus's accomplishments look insignificant. We might spread across the galaxy, evolve into new forms, persist for tens of millions of years in ways they could never have imagined. Or we might destroy ourselves within the next few centuries, making our entire species a brief, bright flash in evolutionary history. Too early to say. The fifth lesson is about the value of diversity. Homo erectus existed as multiple regional populations spread across huge geographic ranges. This metapopulation structure was key to their survival. When one population crashed, others persisted. When one region became uninhabitable, populations elsewhere carried on. They couldn't all go extinct simultaneously unless something truly catastrophic happened to the entire old world at once. We've abandoned that strategy. Humanity today is more interconnected than any species has ever been. What happens in one region affects every other region. Global trade, global communication, global climate change. Our fates are linked in ways that provide tremendous benefits, but also create systemic vulnerabilities. A catastrophe that affects one region can cascade globally. A pandemic can spread worldwide in weeks. An economic collapse in one country destabilizes economies everywhere. Climate change affects all of us simultaneously. This interconnection creates efficiency and prosperity in stable times. But it also means we've lost the insurance that geographic diversity once provided. Homo erectus populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia were relatively isolated from each other. A disease that devastated one region wouldn't necessarily reach the others. A climate shift that destroyed one population's habitat left other populations untouched. We don't have that buffer anymore. We're all in this together, for better and worse. The sixth lesson, and perhaps the most important, deep time humbles us. When you really understand how long Homo erectus existed, when you try to comprehend nearly 2 million years of continuous survival, it puts our entire history in perspective. All of human civilization, everything we've built and achieved, represents the last 12,000 years. That's 0.6% of Homo erectus's timeline, 0.6%. Everything we think of as permanent, cities and nations and cultures and technologies, all of it has existed for less than 1% of the time. Homo erectus walked the earth. Our ancient civilizations, the ones we study as the foundations of human achievement, those are babies compared to Homo erectus populations that maintained their way of life for hundreds of thousands of years. This perspective should make us cautious about assuming we know the right way to live, the right way to organize societies, the right way to interact with our environment. We've been testing our approaches for geological milliseconds. Homo erectus tested theirs for epochs. Maybe we should pay more attention to what worked for them, even if it seems primitive by our standards. Maybe conservation of resources and living within limits, and maintaining stable social structures for very long periods. Maybe those aren't signs of lack of progress. As you drift towards sleep tonight, I want you to hold one image in your mind. Somewhere in Africa, about 1.9 million years ago, a group of Homo erectus is sitting around a fire. They've just come back from hunting. They're working on stone tools, the same hand axes their ancestors made, and their descendants will continue making for 1,000,000 years or more. They're talking, maybe, in whatever simple communication they possess. They're teaching their children. They're maintaining their fire. They're surviving. Fast forward through time. Watch those groups spread across continents. Watch them adapt to new environments. Watch them endure through ice ages and volcanic winters and climate shifts. Watch generations succeed generations, thousands of generations, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The individuals change, but the patterns persist. The tools remain similar. The way of life continues. Nearly 2 million years of this. 2 million years of fires in the darkness, and stone tools and hunting and gathering and teaching and surviving. 2 million years of the same species doing essentially the same things, generation after generation after generation. Longer than you can really comprehend, longer than empires, longer than continents stay in the same position, longer than most species ever exist. And then, finally, it ends. The last populations on Java, isolated and unable to adapt to a changing climate, slowly fade away. The longest chapter in human history closes, but the legacy persists. The body plan they perfected, we still use it. The technologies they pioneered, we built on them. The geographic spread they achieved, we expanded it. The human story they began, we're continuing it. We are their descendants, carriers of their genes and their legacy. Everything we've achieved, we built on foundations they laid, and whether we last another 300,000 years or 3 million or 30 million, whether we spread across the stars or destroy ourselves next century, we'll always be the species that came after Homo erectus, the upstarts trying to match the endurance of our ancient predecessors. 2 million years. Hold that number. Feel its weight. Understand what it means. Then ask yourself, will we make it that long? Do we even want to, if it means giving up innovation and progress and constant change? What are we willing to trade for longevity? What would we refuse to trade? These aren't abstract questions. They're about choices we're making right now, about how we organize our societies, how we treat our environment, how we plan for the future or fail to plan. Homo erectus didn't consciously choose their path. They evolved behaviors and characteristics that happen to promote long-term survival. We have the advantage of consciousness, of being able to choose our path deliberately. But that advantage only matters if we're wise enough to learn from those who came before us. The story of Homo erectus is ultimately a story about time and survival, and what it takes to endure. They proved that humans can last, that our lineage can persist through challenges that would destroy most species, that we carry within us the potential for extraordinary longevity. But they also proved that even successful species eventually face their end, that adaptation and flexibility and geographic spread aren't guarantees of immortality, only ways to buy time. We're buying time right now with our technology and our innovation and our ability to transform our environment. The question is whether we're buying enough time, and at what cost. Homo erectus bought nearly 2 million years by living within limits. How long can we last by exceeding them? We're about to find out. And in a few 100,000 years, if any humans remain, they'll look back at our era and judge whether we made wise choices or fatal mistakes. Sleep well, thinking about deep time and the species that walked before us and the uncertain future stretching ahead. We're all part of the same story, the human story that began millions of years ago and continues through us today. Homo erectus wrote the longest chapter. We're still writing ours, and the ending, as always, remains unknown.